of the Programs Committee on projects related to art at the Institute and recently books at the Institute. He continuously proves to set a fine institutional example for our member and public constituency, make for close collaborator, and embraces a warm friendship. Thank you, Walter. Books at the Institute is a recent initiative born of our broader programming, introducing our audiences to and enabling them to engage with writers presenting innovative, creative, and academic thought and published works on relevant topics addressing Ukraine and Ukrainian history, culture, art, society, journalism, and historical and philosophical thought. We are very excited to welcome today's special guest, novelist, essayist, publisher, editor, translator, and activist, Askold Melnyczuk. During this virtual Zoom presentation, I encourage you to record any questions and comments you may have in the questions and comments panel on this platform for Mr. Melnyczuk about his journey through the writing life, cultural and critical thinking, and advocacy. I'm sure stimulating discussion will follow to everyone's benefit. Askold Melnyczuk has published 4 novels, as well as numerous essays, stories, memoirs, poems, and translations. About his collection of short stories, The Man Who Would Not Bow, released this month, Bob Shakokis wrote, and this basically sums up my own personal perceptions, Askold Melnyczuk fascinates with his cartography, mapping the contours of consciousness and spirit across the centuries. The spectrum of his sensibilities always delights and seduces or provokes and puzzles. Like his Ukrainian forebearer, Gogol, Melnyczuk can summon forth the grotesqueries of continental mysticism and switch lenses to deliver his readers into a contemporary Delillo-esque realm of cold but metaphysically ambiguous realism. He's a literary chameleon and irresistible. His 3rd novel, The House of Widows, was an editor's choice selection of the American Library Association's book list. His 2nd, Ambassador of the Dead, was the Los Angeles Times best book for 2002 and is included on Citizen Works Progressive Reading List. His 1st novel, What Is Told, was a New York Times notable book. He's published a novella about Arthur Rimbaud titled Blind Angel, and translated Girls, a novella by Oksana Zabushko, Ukraine's leading novelist and poet, as well as a selection of poems, 8 Notes from a Blue Angel by Mariana Savka. An essay on visiting Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria was selected as a notable essay for 2008's Best American Essays, as were excerpts from his memoir in progress, Turbulence, Love, in 2010. Last month, a humanistic personal essay on the importance of moral complexity, Why My Favorite Characters to Write Are Often Unsympathetic and Unforgivable, was published on the online platform Literary Hub. He received a 3-year fellowship in fiction from the Lila Wallace Foundation, numerous grants from the NEA for his work as editor of Agni, which he founded in 1972, and for which in 2001 he received the Maggot Award from Penn, which described the magazine as one of America's and the world's most significant literary journals. He has edited 6 books, including 3 volumes in Grey Wolf's Take Three poetry series, as well as an anthology of writing from Ukraine, From the Three Worlds, a volume on the painter Gary Bergstein, and a book of essays about Father Daniel Berrigan. Other work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, the Boston Globe, Plowshares, Grand Street, Poetry, and so on. He's taught at Harvard University and is currently professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Founder of Aerosmith Press, in 2011, he received the George Garrett Award for Outstanding Community Service in Literature from the Associated Writing Programs. With that, I'm pleased to introduce Askold Melnyczuk. Hello, Askold.
Greetings to you.
I did I miss anything? Or do
Oh my
we?
God, no, and I thank you. That's a hyper comprehensive list, and I feel old. But thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you. Дуже приємно з вами тут бути в інституті. I've visited the building, and I really admire the work that you do there. It's a great example of what the Ukrainian kind of diasporan community can do in support of the arts. Such an important area for the community to be backing. So it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. I know that during the pandemic, everything was at a standstill, or it felt like it. So what we did was we tried to reach out to our audiences as best we could, via online Zoom and so forth, other platforms. But it was the best way to keep in contact. And we had a great audience, and they've come back, and we're starting to slowly open the doors again. So hopefully we'll be able to do this in person soon.
Isn't that wonderful to have that human energy back in a room?
Indeed.
Yeah.
I'd like to begin, Askold, if we may, by congratulating you on the release of your short story collection, The Man Who Would Not Bow, published by Grand Iota. Not a big tome, but you cover a lot of territory in this collection with a cast of characters, including a journalist in the Middle Eastern war zone, an unemployed actor struggling with elder care, members of a commune planning to kidnap a priest, a torturer's mother, and finally, Nikolai Gogol wrestling with his angels and demons. Talk a little bit about the genesis of these stories and how they entered your creative sphere and conscience.
Sure, gladly. So yeah, it is a range of stories. They do cover a rather kind of long period. The oldest of them is the story about the folks in the commune planning to kidnap a priest, which dates back to the 90s. And then the most Gogolian of the stories is only a couple of years old. It's called The Little Colon People. And I won't even begin to explain that. But each of the stories has a kind of different birth. Some were painful, some were piece of cake. They all arose from, though were inspired by different occasions. The first story in the collection, and the longest perhaps, called Termites, grew out of a trip I took to Lebanon and Syria at the invitation of a friend back in 2007. It was a haunting trip. It was one of the last moments one was able to really be there more or less safely. And it was an unforgettable trip that took me about 5 or 6 years to be able to capture some aspects of that experience in the story. It's a story about a journalist who supports US policies in the Middle East, and then kind of goes on to discover what it is that he's been backing to his chagrin and dismay. Then a story like The Walk With Us had a very different sort of inspiration. Shortly after we began the war in Iraq, there were a series of photographs, you may remember, some of you may remember, of what had happened in that notorious prison in Iraq called Abu Ghraib. There was one photograph in particular of a female American soldier holding an Iraqi prisoner of war who was naked and had a black hood over his head, and he was being held in a noose. And that photograph sort of went all around the world, was featured on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And I was haunted by that photograph. I spent a long time trying to think about how to respond to it. I realized that there really wasn't much to say about what was depicted in that photograph, because that photograph itself was an editorial, if you will, as powerful an anti-war editorial as you might find. And yet I couldn't put it out of mind. It really kind of haunted me. And the thing that I began to wonder about was, how was it that a person could wind up in that horrible position, that this was something she felt she needed to do, that a young woman, a soldier in the American military, no doubt well trained and so on, would feel that it was all right to be treating another human being that way. And I began to think about her family, where she might have come from, and what might have created this kind of tight imagination in a person. And so the story turned into a story about her mother, and her mother's sort of marriage and problems within the family that might have created a path toward this sad, unnecessary conclusion. There is another story about, well, in the title story, The Man Who Would Not Bow, is a kind of novel in brief, as it begins with the Russian Revolution and winds up with a story about two Ukrainian exiles who are trying to remake their lives in New York, and all the sort of struggles that accompany such an tragic and unsettling circumstance, and an attempt to try to reconfigure a life in a world for which nobody was prepared. So each of the stories had a kind of different a different genesis. The last story in the collection is in fact based on many years of reflecting on the work and life of Nikolai Gogol, or Mykola Hohol, as he is also known. He's a writer with whom I've had a love-hate relationship for a long time. He's got one story in particular that I think is as great as anything in literature, called The Overcoat. And I think it was Dostoevsky who said that all of Russian literature comes out of Hohol's Overcoat. I remember I read a lot of books about him, literary criticism and biography. And there was a wonderful Canadian-Ukrainian literary critic, George Lutsky. I don't know if you ever crossed paths with him. Yep. Who wrote a fabulous book called Nikolai Gogol, aka Nikolai Gogol, aka Mykola Hohol, and he talked about the bifurcated identity that Hohol wrestled with, and that interested me for obvious reasons, since I think that it's a fairly commonplace struggle for children of exiles and refugees to try to find a way to contend with their dual or more multiple identities. So all the stories gave me an occasion to reflect on something that was gnawing at me one way or another.
Is there a method of sequencing the stories in any particular order? In other words, does that affect our understanding of their narrative? Because they almost look like, I had the impression that some might have been works in progress that were begging to be completed. Others seemed that they were written earlier and not later. There was definitely a sensibility of kind of like this kind of like time factor. So I wanted to know if there was any kind of order to that.
Really, the sequencing had more to do with a sense of subject pacing and kind of what made it a narrative arc that made sense for me. You know, it's a book of stories does not have anything like the arc of a novel, and yet one does want to have a sense of collusion between the stories and a sense of thematic relationship and tension there. And so if there's anything that binds all the stories together, it is that I think all of them deal with war and its aftermath in one way or another. And it made sense to me to place a story that's set in the most recent war story, if you will, as the first story, and in a way kind of pushing from there backwards to the start of these exiles' journey, which in some ways for me went all the way back to Hohol. I'd be curious to know which stories you thought were earlier, or which ones were excerpted.
Well, I thought, for example, Walk with Us.
Yes.
Seemed to me that it wasn't I didn't get the sense it was complete.
Hmm.
I was waiting for it to develop, and all of a sudden it says, accept the invitation. When the time comes, walk with us. So, I mean, it's left to the reader, obviously, to continue. But things of that sort. It was a little disjointed at times, but I mean, I thoroughly loved the context of this kind of dichotomy between, good and bad, and kind of this people who are sinners, and how do they atone for that versus non-sinners. So there was this whole kind of sphere of polarity. I have to admit, for me personally, it wasn't a struggle to read through them, because sometimes I'll just fly through something, but you have a way of writing where the reader is almost forced to read word for word and really relish in your style, which that's another thing I really appreciated a lot. So, but and so this is like the first short stories I've read by you, and I'd like to know, how does the approach to short story writing differ to your approach to long form, and what are the differing challenges for you?
Sure. In a lot of ways, a short story is closer to a poem than it is to a novel. And in a story, I mean, I'm glad that you were forced to slow down, because I think that's the whole point of style. I believe deeply that, as Dante's translator Walter Benyon once said, slowness is beauty. And I think that one of the things that a writer tries to do is determine the pace at which a reader experiences their work. And so that's where a density of language is in some ways something a reader might be more willing to wrestle with in a story than in a novel. What I love about stories is the opportunity to enter into very different spaces and sensibilities in a kind of short space, kind of a quick in and out. And, for instance, the story you're talking about, Walk With Us, for me, that is the ending. And I couldn't imagine going on with that one, because the goal there was for the mother to, in that story, that's the mother of a torturer trying to come to terms with what her daughter had done.
Right.
And she is finally discovering a way that she can say something to her daughter she'd never been able to say before, and reveal a kind of personal failing that she had, that allows her to, if you will, offer a hand to her daughter to step out of the circle of guilt and suffering that she will be enduring because of her own actions. So for me, that was the natural kind of ending to the story. In a novel, you can include anything. It's the kitchen sink. What I love about that form is, well, indeed, I think all of fiction offers a kind of opportunity that not enough writers avail themselves of. It is an opportunity to write about character, to write about feeling, to write about ideas, and you can include essays, you can revel in description of lands. I mean, that is where the world enters in. The Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben said beautifully that in fact, what novels offer us are an initiation into life itself, by showing us life in motion. And that to me is sort of an ennobling characterization of our humble work. You
mentioned in your recent essay that appeared in LitHub that it's a way of also really revealing a truth. It's not necessarily sensationalist fantasy, but you're really using it to tell the truth.
Well, it's one of the goals of fiction, as I understand it, is to offer an image of plausible cause and effect, a way to come to understand how and why something has happened. Another word for cause and effect is karma.
Right.
What has happened to a character? What happened? How did one moment in a character's life been prepared by a series of other actions that can be traced back as far as your imagination allows? They're always also provisional sort of theories about humans and behavior, and that's a way in which fiction is able to tell lies that lie deeper than the truth. There isn't the same sort of pretense of knowingness that I think all historians and writers of nonfiction must presume. Every story is a kind of snapshot of an imagination, and the imaginary realm itself is a very strange place. It's a place in which you step out of the kind of daily run of experience and enter into a zone that is both purifying and redemptive. I find that's at least my experience of reading and kind of encountering art that matters to me.
I always saw the short story in terms of a phrase that I've championed for many years, notations in passing. That you're walking down the street and you see something, and it's just something in passing that you keep walking, but it remains in your conscience, and all of a sudden you start asking questions about that, or you start creating a narrative about that, and it could last 5 minutes, maybe 3 seconds, 2 minutes, but that's basically what a short story is. You're taking that kind of notation and you're just expounding on an idea, and it may end or it may not end the way you want it, but that's the idea is there. So it's kind of like a snapshot.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Faulkner said that every novelist is a failed story writer, and every story writer is a failed poet. And again, the trajectory there is from the compression of language. If you take Pound's definition of poetry as language charged with meaning to the utmost degree, that's where I think, again, that's why I make the analogy between poetry and short fiction, because you want to give readers something of the density of and kind of life intensity of a movie inside a snapshot, and that kind of you do that's at least the goal. So anyway,
how do you approach that with your students, for example? I mean, I don't want to go too much into teaching,
sure,
but it's not like you can just tell them one thing one day and this is what you need to do to be a writer.
right?
It's a lifetime journey and a process. Right. So how do you guide them in that respect, between the two kind of genres of writing?
Sure. Great question, and a huge subject. And of course, it goes without saying that every student begins at a different place, and your goal as a teacher is to take everybody from their point A to their point B, and hope that somebody else will carry them further, and that they will then take themselves all the way. So again, it always depends on where the student is and what you're bumping into. But I think that in some ways the most important moment in any young writer's life is when they discover their true material. And that is that may sound obvious, and some people do take it for granted. But certainly in my case, and the case of a lot of writers that I know, that's not exactly it. I think that most writers I know begin by imitating writers they loved when they were, first started reading. And
artists do the same thing, and musicians do the same thing. It's no different.
Of course, right. Right. You go to the Met and copy the masters, and you're learning technique, and you're learning to see, And at the same time, you're struggling to discover what it is that you have to say and what it is that you really are seeing when you're not looking at somebody else's art and creation. So that in my case, for years and years, I mean, I grew up reading the kind of great story writers, the WASP story writers of the 50s, John Cheever and John O'Hara. And so my earliest sort of fictions that mercifully remain unpublished were largely about stockbrokers in New York. I was son of a guy working at a Budweiser plant in New Jersey, and was writing this probably without ever having been to, having ever met a stockbroker. And so, and also in part because of the material that I was carrying around, which was, the kind of Ukrainian refugee story, I had no language that I had read in English to kind of help me recognize that was plausible and credible material. And, that's, I think, the case for many young writers. So they all have singular stories whose value they so often fail to recognize because they don't know that their home in their small town in Normal, Illinois, is Ithaca. That's where the Odyssey begins. And so kind of helping to guide them, first of all, to recognizing their material is one element of teaching. Then the next is, of course, the technical part, which is a lifetime's learning, as you suggest. It is you never grow comfortable or at ease in your craft. You're always trying new things. You discover, sometimes to your chagrin, that you have certain obsessions and certain subjects that you kind of keep returning to, but you keep pushing yourself and you keep trying to expand the range of material and life that you can get on the page. And then, again, the kinds of craft things that you start talking about with student work are really a matter of sentence by sentence of recognizing where something needs to be developed and amplified, and pointing out where they're just clearing their throats and preparing to kind of get to their stuff. You're also encouraging students, and in that way encouraging yourself, to be always bolder, to always be pushing into territory they have not gone, to be addressing the issues, if you will, in the moment that are of the moment, in their time, in their generation, in the world right now, and then thinking about how to do that in a way that doesn't replicate the sort of work that they will find in the daily newspapers that is already kind of being played out on multiple screens in our multi-screened world. Right. And what does that come down to? It comes down to recognizing that there are singular things that language can do. There are things that we only understand in our own experience when we're able to find the words for them. I'd like to say that I learned how to love by reading 17th century English poetry. There is a vocabulary for the kind of subtler parts of our lives and experience that we don't learn in school. We learn them in literature. We learn them in art.
That's why there's such a huge push to keep the library open, and this is worldwide. Yeah. So let me ask you this. Would you read something for us from one of your stories?
Sure. Delighted. Given the setting and the occasion, I thought that I'd take on the Gogol story. The Gogol story is called Gogol's Noose, and it's on a bow to Gogol's celebrated story, The Nose. And the kind of frame for the story is that the unearthing of this early manuscript, which happens to be the only work he ever wrote in Ukrainian, is of inestimable scholarly value. This futuristic fantasy, whose title may loosely be translated as My Noose, may well be the strangest thing that the strangest of all writers ever produced. And I'm going to read a letter here that Hohol. I just parenthetically have to add that one of the books that infuriated me about Gogol was Nabokov's elegantly written book called Gogol, in which there's a passage where he describes himself as having screaming nightmares when he imagines Gogol continuing to write in that little Russian tongue. And that's sort of, I've always wanted to get back at him for that. And this is in part my conversation with him. So again, this is a letter to his to a kind of mentor figure for him, Alexandra Smirnova, who was herself French and married to a Russian diplomat, and a kind of marriage of convenience. And she and Gogol traveled around together a lot to Italy. And so here he is, and she was his kind of, she introduced him to, Italian culture, Italian society, in a lot of ways, kind of ancient history, and gave him that sense of European culture that he was open to. And it was that openness, I think, that's remarkable about him. But that openness was in tension with the very sort of Slavic God hunger that finally got him at the end. Anyway, here's the letter. Dearest Alexandra, I've always wondered how it is that more historians don't commit suicide, that it's the poets who seem driven toward self-destruction. When you consider how impossible it is to map with any depth and honesty the contours of a single consciousness, you realize that all historians are fantasts, and more, liars of great magnitude. They keep pretending to speak authoritatively about the movements of masses of people across huge expanses of time. Yet it doesn't take more than a moment's sober reflection to realize that such claims are 6 shades darker than black, absurd. Translating the murmur of immemorial bees sounds positively scientific beside it. In your letter, you ask why I don't simply join a church. Wouldn't that solve my problem, address my need for community? By which, of course, you mean spiritual community, which offers training in the path to sainthood and prepares us for what may or may not await us in the afterlife. I can answer your good question, though the answer itself may not please you any more than it satisfies me. But one's nature is one's nature, and there are only so many elements within it you can do something about. This is one against which I'm powerless. Explain it to yourself as you wish. Blame it on the fact I'm Ukrainian. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that whenever I hear of a church, no matter how esoteric, espousing Gnosticism or orthodoxy or some obscure occultism, I laugh, as though truth were susceptible to codification. And as to how they, the government, will use me, they call me a realist. Can you believe it? A social reformer. What drivel, what fools I'm surrounded by. But I see the future. I see my country's future unfolding naturally out of its past. I see the peasants, former slaves, rising up and destroying their masters, slaying them, raping their women, eating their children. 4 centuries of oppression will require an orgy of bloodletting as expiation. Don't imagine it will take anything else. Once these monsters have spent themselves, having utterly surrendered to their appetites, they will find these appetites may be sated and have an end, and yet life itself continues, as the Romans discovered. We're either eaten by our children, or we end by dissembling the old truths, which never become irrelevant. Oh, but Italy, a dream to be here. My first poem, how could I forget, was titled Italy, but I published it anonymously. I was 18. What did I understand of fame? Later, there was Hans Kuckelgarten. Things German were all the rage. 1829. My prospects weren't good. A reviewer essentially called it a smelly crap. I immediately went out and bought up all the copies. I didn't want the public to see me as a failure before I began. I took all the copies I could find, rented a room at an inn, and burned everything in the fireplace. But all that is behind me now. The sequel on which I'm working, while also a fantasy, bears little resemblance to the first volume. Something keeps luring me away from familiar times and places into a country and a future which can only be imagined as unfolding in that mythical new world of the United States of America in the 21st century. 2 centuries and 7,000 miles away. Inevitably, I've given it some features of our present-day nightmare. For instance, as you know, we landowners pay no taxes, and yet our peasants who work our land for us do. It is a clever system. Those who work must pay for the privilege. That's something I believe will carry forward into the future. I hope you don't mind if I send you a few pages of the work now and again. All I ask is that you respond honestly. If something strikes you as off, I count on you as always to let me know. Above all, hurry. There are no humans left in Rome. Only cani e americani, as the locals say.
I think partially it seemed, when I was reading that, it seemed to me it wasn't only to her, it was also he was writing to himself as well. He was trying to figure all of this, all of these issues that were just weighing on his head, from social commentary to absurdity, actually, of life. So it when I finished that, and then in relation to other contemporary, I think, authors, writers, and even historians, there seems to be almost kind of like a renewed interest in Gogol. I think as readers know and acknowledge, social satire is like really deeply embedded in the manners of his characters. Kind of like a psychological portraiture, I think you can say, not overly romanticized or superficial, but kind of like imbued with attributes that show like a really wide range of human passion, dignity, even to the lowliest greasy fellow. And where he even says here he's got greasy hair and he's just barely kind of, his appearance is very poor, to the most unattractive of characters. But at the same time, there's a lot of humor mixed in with the misery. And I think it's kind of like that bifurcation you were talking about, of those experiences that 200 years later, we tend to also experience. One of your writer peers, Irene Zabit, was currently writing a book centered around his life, albeit fiction. And George Saunders, I don't know if you read that or not, in his essay collection, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, I believe, explores and offers up a kind of like many perceptual possibilities of reading and understanding of the Noose. Not the Noose, but the Noose.
Right.
Do you think this is coincidence that this is happening now, or kind of intentional resurgence?
Right. Are there such things as coincidences? I actually know of another writer who had a Fulbright to Cave last year to research Gogol. So yeah, there's certainly something in the air. And I know it's interesting because my old friend Jhumpa Lahiri, the novelist and writer, has a character named Gogol in one of her books.
My daughter loves her work.
Oh, yeah, she's a wonderful writer. She's a wonderful writer, yeah, actually, I published that first the title story of her first collection, Ananyi, Interpretive Maladies. She was a reader at the literary magazine I edited, Agni, back in the day. Another friend, a Chinese writer, Ha Jin, also is a kind of great fan of Gogol. So he has maintained a foothold among writers, if not always among a kind of broad audience. And I do think that it is a combination of, as you say, social satire, but also sympathy for the downtrodden, a kind of writer confronting a moment of kind of great disparity in wealth and in a world that was full of rampant with injustice. So again, not unlike our world, perhaps not unlike the world at any moment. And he offered a series of interesting approaches that are make him a kind of a visionary writer. His he let loose his imagination in a way that I think is inspiring and encourages us to kind of cut loose from conventional realism. And it's funny because he is used to be regarded and called a realist writer, kind of social commentator. So yeah, all of that. It is interesting that there are 4 people that I know working on him right now. And as they say, literature is news that stays news. So
Oh, 1 second here, I lost my notes.
let me ask you a question.
Ask me a question.
So, how does since I know that you spend your life in rooms surrounded by pretty nice art, how does your experience of a painting differ from your experience of work of literature?
Not a whole lot, actually. When I look at a painting, a sculpture, a photograph, it could be video, even performance. The visual stimulus is obviously there, and the brain accepts that stimulus, but my mind sees a narrative, and the first thing I look at is what something is about and the story that it's telling me, whether it's an abstract piece or a representational piece or even a hyper-realist piece. And technique comes later. I don't really consider that the primary source of quality. But I look at the narrative, and if it sings to me or if it says something to me, I'll keep looking at it. And there's a method I like to use called looking slowly. And for example, if I go into an art gallery or into a museum, and I look around and I see something that attracts my eye, and I'll go to it. And then I'll sit there and I'll either sit or stand and I'll look at it for a while. And I'm not talking about taking an iPhone, snapping a picture and walking to the next painting, snapping a picture like that you see a lot happening today, but like really spend 3 to 5 minutes with it. And after a while, a narrative emerges about what's inside of that frame as well as what's outside of the possibilities of what's outside of it. And then that's how I start to really appreciate something. And then all the techniques and the style and coloration, texture, if there is, all of that comes later on. That I learned actually from my parents. We used to go to the Cleveland Museum of Art virtually every other weekend. I grew up there. And there was something new to see every week, whether it was ancient armor from the medieval days or contemporary minimalism, color field painting, impressionism, abstract expressionism, and so on, and also the various mediums. But there was a distinct appreciation for beauty, and that beauty translates also into reading. Some readings are very laborious. Some are very lighthearted. Some are predictable. Some are unpredictable, and it's the finding of kind of the beauty in a sentence. For example, someone that I've been reading a lot this past year has been the revisiting of James Salter. I truly enjoy his way of sentences. He has a masterful way of packing in a lot of punch without any kind of flowery language. And he has a great sense of space, a great sense of place, and a great sense of time. Mm-hmm. And a good word will do that. A good sentence will do that. And then you build upon that. I'm going to, on Sunday, for example, see one of my old college art professors at an event at the Ukrainian Museum. And she and a late professor were the 2 people who actually taught me or retaught me how to read and write. And it wasn't until college that happened. And with that came also the relearning how to see. So all of those combined kind of feed this curiosity on virtually on a daily basis. So very, very thankful for that.
Sure. Remind me of the opening of Rilke's Malt Brygge. I am learning, at last I'm learning to see. And, sort of under that sort of inspiration that
Yeah.
I spent an hour and a half in front of Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victoire a couple of months ago during the pandemic. It was and you know, I'm glad to hear that in fact you too recognize that slowness is beauty, or that beauty requires a different orientation to time. It's not time as a means to get somewhere else, but time as an
Correct.
end in itself.
Indeed. I want to throw something out at you. It's a little bit more frivolous. However, it's on topic. I was recently present in a heated online discussion among some peers. If not, some of them with a kind of like a revisionist bent to them, that sounded plenty, about Gogol's name, and then kind of not translating, but transliterating it, the G instead of H, and then Nicola instead of Nikolai. What's your thought on that for the international public? Should it stay the way it is historically, or should there be an activism to change that, as some would think?
You know, No, you know, yeah, it's sure. It's an interesting question. I mean, I remember all the sort of different struggles around different matters of orthography, you know, particularly pertaining to Ukrainian and, you know, the Ukraine or Ukraine, things like that. And I can certainly see where some people can get their backs up about that. It doesn't hugely disturb me one way or the other, so long as the work is read and responded to and the kind of substance is there. I do, however, think that the argument and conversation are worth having, if only because they bring to light the kind of complexity of the writer and his circumstances, and also allow the whole question of Ukraine to enter into the picture. I think that most writers that I know still consider Gogol a Russian writer, and there is perhaps a slightly different awareness of that now. You know, it's the kind of thing that since he wrote in Russian, doesn't that make him a Russian writer? On the other hand, as I like to point out, Samuel Beckett wrote in French, and yet he is considered an Irish writer.
Right.
And of course, you know, I write in American, and yet I'm an English language writer. You know, so those kinds of claims to identity are spurious, I think. Ultimately, I mean, they're he was a Ukrainian writer. Whether people start, you know, do we change the spelling of KU to Kiev, you know, from KI to KY?
Mm-hmm.
I fear that in neither case does the spelling lead to a correct or familiar pronunciation. So it kind of doesn't, the intended, the hope for effect is not achieved. But if nothing, I mean, I think the conversation is good to have. However it shakes out, I think the more important point is to that the writer be read, and the questions that he raises and the feelings that he brings to us, our experience of him, be dealt with.
Let's go back a little bit. Growing up, what is your first memory of literature personally? This could be poetry or prose, stories, whether read aloud by your parents or yourself. Sure. And is there a tradition, particularly in fiction, that influenced and continues to influence your writing, growing up, that is?
Sure. My mother aspired to be a poet, and in fact, sitting on my desk is a 3-page typed letter from the editor of a journal in Lviv, responding to a handful of poems that she had sent him, rejecting them, but saying, if you make this and this change, and send us, you know, 7 more poems, we will publish your book. And it's a very detailed letter with kind of line by line edits, very moving. And it's dated August 1939. And so you can imagine that was a conversation that was not continued. She'd been at University View, and
that was right before the invasion of Poland.
Right, exactly. exactly. So that it was a career that was aborted, but she loved reading. She loved literature, and in fact, it was hugely touching and moving because at the age of 98, when she passed, well, although she had what some doctors call dementia, and I prefer to describe as forgetfulness, she would spend 8 to 10 hours a day, and no exaggeration, reading, even though she would forget what she read. The last sentence she read, the moment she moved on, the whole act of it was somehow grounding and meaningful and gave substance to her days. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that it was she who inspired a love for reading. And the memory of the first thing I recall her reading are things like Żuczok Szczerbaczok or List Mi Quieta. So, the poems of Franco, and then of course Shevchenko. When I was, I think, 6 or 7 years old, I had been forced to memorize послание, смеркає, світає день, Боже минає, тільки ямо окаянний, день і ніч плачу на розпуті, велелюдними ніхто не бачить, і не бачить, не знає, оглухли, не чують, кайданами мітаючи, правдою торгують, і Господа зневажають, etc., etc. So I remember reciting that at the Ukrainian National Home in Elizabeth at the age of like 7. What the hell did I understand of Shevchenko's
regardless, you have fantastic memory.
Well, it was, it embedded itself. I mean, yes. And Shevchenko does have a way of turning a phrase that seems to lock things into memory. So anyway, so that was the earliest stuff. And I got things like Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe in Ukrainian. And it was only after going to school that I began to read in English and so on and so on. But, the sort of significant and influential reading that I kind of like to thank for it sort of driving me in this direction kind of comes a little bit later, and it probably comes at that age when so many of us are most vulnerable and hungry at the age of like 14, 15, 16, as you're beginning to kind of discover and enter the world. And the books that were current the time for me were things like Hermann Hesse and Richard Brautigan, and then, as I mentioned, John Cheever and John O'Hara somehow kind of got into the picture. Others crowd in, but one of the kind of great breakthrough reading experiences in my life came when I was 17 and read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. It was one of those books that I still remember. The July night in 1975 at 4 a.m. when not 75, 72, I finished the book at 4 a.m. and went out into the night and looked up at the sky, and it seemed like as though I'd seen it for the first time. And that's to me what a kind of great reading experience can do. It can so pull you into itself that it returns you restored to life and the world, and ready to engage it.
Right.
So I mean, I could go on because of course there's so many writers that feed you along the way, but
no, but I think those formative years actually inform basically of what your experiences are going to be like within that realm, whether it's reading, whether it's music, art. It has a huge influence. I mean, I like to kind of sometimes delve into that kind of background to see what makes you tick. Much of your earlier work, especially long form writing, engages characters in complex moral circumstances, set against the background of the emigre experience or experiences, plural. How did your own background inform your approach to these narratives, especially in your first 3 novels, What Is Told, Ambassador of the Dead, and House of Widows?
Well, I mean, as I think suggested earlier, this is material that I avoided for pretty important 10 years as a writer, and I had characters whose names were K or B or L, who had no backgrounds and came from nowhere at all and found themselves in some kind of trouble. And it was in part because I didn't feel that the material was exactly legitimate. I had not encountered it in English. I mean, I encountered Ukrainian material and Ukrainian stuff in Ukrainian, and and that's the kind of you hear that a lot from I hear that a lot from student writers who say they have not seen themselves represented in literature, and it's a kind of a common complaint these days. And I say to them, wow, that's so damn lucky. You mean your story has not yet been told, so you're going to be the first to do it. Fabulous, go for it. When I finally did turn to it, kicking and screaming, I discovered stories that were kind of earth-shaking, a world that was so complicated, so full of pain, so full of hope. I'm talking about the whole kind of Ukrainian refugee experience, so full of specific circumstances and situations that had particular nouns and verbs associated with it, and that had not, again, in my experience, been uttered in English. And for years, I looked for a way to try to tell those stories so that they would not feel burdensome, so they would not feel too ponderous, too heavy, too depressing, as they sometimes appear to me, as I kind of imagine them. And a lot of the kind of work and drafting of my first couple of novels had to do with trying to find a form that would, as Beckett says, accommodate the mess of life. And of course, as you grow older, you recognize that what you felt were the singular tragedies of your own family and your own people, if you will, are much more, unfortunately, much more universal than you knew. And you recognize that that kind of emigre and refugee story is being told and retold time and time again in our moment now, obviously with Afghanistan and so many other, and Latin America. So I guess that's how, and partly because I came to it later. I think I came to it finally in my late 20s. That it took 3 books or so to kind of absorb those stories and those histories, and I don't know that I'll return to them in the next one.
Where does that leave Smedley?
So
all that being said, it's like it goes out way into left field, and I had to kind of pinch myself at times, and where is this coming from?
Yeah, well, Smedley, I confess, I wrote as a book to cheer myself up in a very tough time. Both my parents were aging, ill, preparing for the great transition, and my sister and I were very lucky to be able to be involved in those last years of their lives, and sometime, at some point, well into that period, I was sitting in the library in Cambridge reading some 17th century biography, and at some point this voice kind of began to make wisecracks about the characters who were being described in that biography, and it made me laugh. And it had been a period in which I had not done much laughing, and I said, I need to spend time with this voice. And so this is the novel Andrei's referring to is told in the voice of a randy 15-year-old who is had gotten himself in trouble in school and is having the usual 15-year-old troubles with love, and his father's a professor of poetry who's just decided that he is gay, and the kid and the family's falling apart, and the kid has got to figure out what the hell his role in the family is going to be, if there's going to be any family, and so on. So yeah, it was to me a very sweet place to return to and spend time with, and I was very happy to be with this character, and I'm hoping that he gives others similar opportunities to escape from potential travails.
The escape for me was that it seemed like a break in writing of what we would call serious writing. I mean, there is still a lot of character development. There is still a lot of prosaic thought in this adventure. It had almost kind of like a movie narrative to it. So it wasn't that laborious to read, but it did offer a lot of laughter, which I
Good.
found very, very kind of autobiographical, from my own experiences, from friends' experiences, and I could just go along with the flow. And in that respect, it was quite a good kind of coming of age tale. So
Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it.
I wanted to go back to when you were mentioning Abu Ghraib and that photo that you saw, but more so, if you can talk a little bit about that essay you wrote, and it's more about forgiving the unforgiven,
Right.
and it really profoundly moved me when I read that. You sent me a hard copy before it had been published online, and it affirmed in me like a vast series of beliefs in the human condition. So long as you're a responsible global participant, regardless of background. And it comes at a time when I think vast swaths of our society are exhibiting these kind of transactional or indifferent behavioral sensibilities, if that makes sense.
Sure.
You dig deep into personal history as well as relevant literary references in which really abound in the essay. And as a reader and writer, what triggered this personal essay at this particular time? And what do you wish for the lay reader to glean and think about from the piece and in writing in general in terms of these personal essays? Because I just thought it was profound. So
thanks, Lydia. I'm very touched to hear you say that, and glad. It's an essay I've been trying to write for years and been thinking about for years. To kind of summarize it briefly, it's an essay about why I write stories about very difficult people, not always likable people, and what it is I hope readers gain from the experience. And it's it's also partly a response to a kind of tick among a lot of readers these days who like to speak about the relatability of characters in books that they enjoy, how they relate to the characters, and that's what makes a book meaningful and important. And that's always sort of frustrated me because I know that I read not to have my own experience affirmed, but to encounter somebody else's experience of life and the world. And when I read Crime and Punishment, it's not like I'm associating with Raskolnikov, and yet at the same time, I'm recognizing in the widest range of characters, from Kafka to Shirley Hazard, to from Saunders to Auster to a sense of myself as well, for sure. I'm not relating to them, but I am recognizing that their experiences are not foreign to me, that within limits, nothing human is alien to me, and that's what makes things so kind of disturbing and unsettling about the world. All the sorts of horrors that we witness are being kind of committed by people like you and me, who found themselves in specific circumstances, and whose sometimes awful behaviors must be faced if we are to understand who and what we are. There was one of those sort of amazing experience I had some years ago, actually right after September 11th. I mean, it was a dramatic moment. I was sitting in the Friends Meeting House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at a talk by a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, who said about the guys piloting the plane, well, now they're the ones who need our prayers and forgiveness because the crime they have committed is going to have such dire consequences. They're the ones who will suffer. And that was such an extreme statement of an idea that is, after all, very similar, if not exactly the same, to the notion that's propounded in the Beatitudes, but in the Sermon on the Mount. In recognizing that we are enjoined to turn the other cheek. We're enjoined to forgive our enemies, forgive them for they know not what they do. And we seem to be in a very fiercely judgmental age. Many people are being called out appropriately for many transgressions. Once people have been called out for them, however, things can't really quite stop there. We also need to allow everybody a path forward to be able to re-enter the human realm. That's sort of that was the impulse behind that story, Walk With Us. How do you find a path forward after you've done something as awful as one can imagine? It's an ideal that we pay a lot of lip service to, but see so very little of in our actual encounters in the world. Moreover, I venture to say for myself that I fail to be able to live up to those ideals most of the time, but I know that I lean on them and recognize instinctively the importance of forgiveness, the importance of recognizing that every being was once this sort of infant, suckling at its mother's breast and looking longingly at the creature who had brought it into existence. That that to me is what our imagination can do for us. That is, that we can recognize in everything we encounter a beginning that's absolutely vulnerable, a being that is shaped step by step into what it is, but has within it a beginning of openness and really kind of love at its core. And that we as individuals and a society will be much better off if we can look for those structures that allow us to help all of us, each other, to come back to our best selves. There's, the essay ends with a quote from Chekhov, which is also a kind of creed that I wholeheartedly subscribe to. He says that it's not, he was actually responding to Zola's support of Dreyfus, Albert Dreyfus, who'd been charged with anti-Semitism, who'd been brought up on false charges because of French anti-Semitism at the time. And Chekhov completely agreed with Zola's defense of Dreyfus, but he said, in fact, it's the job of the writer is never to support the prosecution, but to plead the case for the condemned as he is undergoing punishment. And we're all in a way undergoing the punishment of embodiment, and in a way I think we all want someone to plead our case, to recognize us as what we had once hoped to be, if we're not that now.
Right.
And so
there was a quote in there, and there was a short narrative in that essay where Susan Sontag brings up the notion of swallowing a pill where you would forget all of that and then kind of start anew. And I found that almost kind of like, even with her intellect, I found that kind of a cop-out. So almost like suicide in a sense, that you're eliminating kind of your raison d'etre, for example, and then starting anew, but a new slate doesn't justify all of that's happened before. So she kind of negates it, and I found it very disturbing. I'm glad you mentioned that you and your wife sat with her and talked about it for a long time, but it was kind of a shock to read that someone would offer up that
Well,
notion.
to be fair to Susan there, this is a moment that occurs in her really wonderful book regarding the pain of others. The whole book is
Right,
wrestling with this question, and it is perhaps you understand that she's speaking, sort of metaphorically, and is saying that, what she hopes for, it suggests is that that what humanity needs is a kind of complete sort of mind wipe, to forget the grievances that we have against each other as individuals and as nations, as ethnicities, as races. And, yes, we all kind of get that. The problem with it is that if we have a mind wipe, a memory wipe, there's nothing that's going to protect you from repeating the same sins and crimes over again. And so that's my kind of counter to that is that we have to remember and then strive as best we can to forgive.
right.
Because I think in that forgiveness, there's also a kind of freedom for both the victim and the guilty party. There is a kind of there's an opportunity of mutual freedom. I mean, I think that it's the kind of thing that yeah, anyway, I think that
let's move on to something a little lighter. You're not, I mean, it's a good topic that deserves a lot of discourse.
Sure, and
it's not in one evening. This is as well. This could be a serial. This could be a continual communal discussion. So it's
crime and punishment. Just let me frame it another way. Do you believe in do you believe in punishment? Right. Both. It's really interesting that both Dostoevsky and Simone Weil really believed in the importance of punishment, and as something that the criminal desires. That once a crime has been committed, the world is kind of brought back to itself, and things are rectified only once the punishment has been administered. And there is another way of thinking, but I think that's what brings things to another plane. Anyway, I'm happy to.
It's the opposite. It's the polar plane. That's
right.
Where that's headed.
Right.
I wanted to also touch upon your work as an editor and translator.
Sure.
I believe, for example, it's not overshadowed by your writing, but works as two complementary disciplines that feed the latter, if that makes sense to you.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about your role with Aerosmith Press and the mission of the small independent publishing house? What kinds of writers do you prefer to work with, and how do you select who to work with, the work to work with, and do you look for like a long-term relationship, or is it something that's of the moment that is of interest to you?
Sure. Let me just preface before I get into Aerosmith is that I spent about 30 years editing this journal Agni, and
Right.
I finally kind of stepped away from that because I was tired of being 10,000 pages behind in my reading every morning.
It was a type of punishment.
It began to be that, yes, and so I absolved myself and stepped away from editing entirely for a few years, but the habit returned. In fact, the kind of birth of Aerosmith Press is relevant to our conversation tonight, and to particularly in this setting, because it was my dear friend, the great writer, Ukrainian writer, Oksana Zabushko, who emailed me and said that she was coming to New York to a conference at Penn. And she had a book of poetry in English, but she did not have any of her prose. And she had recently published Field Guide to Ukrainian Sex, but it had not yet been published in Halina Harin's marvelous translation. And so she needed something to kind of carry with her to show to the writers she'd be meeting in New York. I think she was going to be on a panel with Bernard-Henri Levy, and people like Rushdie and stuff were going to be around. And so she wanted something with her. And I had the summer before translated her kind of long story / novella Girls with her standing over my shoulder. She was, I think, maybe visiting Cambridge and Harvard or something that summer. It was quite a terrifying experience to have the author there breathing down your neck and saying, no, no, it's wrong. You got it wrong. But it was also kind of great fun as well. I mean, her, as you know, her style, she is indeed a high stylist and a very demanding reader. And you certainly don't get to rush through as a Bushka story or novel. She wants you to immerse and sink in and enter into her sensibility. So it was a kind of a rich experience on many fronts. And so I had that translation and the hunger, and I wanted to give her something to carry with her. So I started a press, and that was the first of the books that we published. Because I did not want to replicate my earlier experience of feeling overwhelmed by work coming in over the transom, I decided from the start that this would be a press that worked by solicitation only, and I would be choosing and inviting writers to come to us. And my goal in choosing the writers for the press is twofold, in that I wanted both to have young writers who I believe were doing important work, but for one reason or another were having a hard time finding a place for it. And I could get down to very kind of specific cases, but I'll sort of leave it at that for now. And at the same time, I recognize that for their work to be noticed, it would help if some older recognized writers were part of a series. So that I wrote to actually, the first writer I ever wrote to when I was a kid in high school was one of the great American beat poets, though he didn't like to be called a beat poet, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was the publisher of Allen Ginsberg's Howl and Gregory Corso and all that stuff. And I had written to him in high school, and he had written back, and that was one of the first moments where I recognized that these writers really are there on the other end of your typewriter or pen, and indeed are game to respond if you know how to engage them. So anyway, so Ferlinghetti sent a long poem, and we published that, and other writers like Donald Hall sent work, and we published that. And then there were young writers like Maureen McLean, who is now a writer with Farrar Straus Giroux. In fact, I think they're just publishing her selected poems. We published her first book. She was somebody I had met in Cambridge, and so it was, it was a combination of accidental encounters and selective reading. I still kind of continue to read literary journals now and then, and friends pass on people. The great American publisher Jay Laughlin, who became a good friend in the last years of his life, who's a founder of New Directions, had a kind of a line: "One good writer leads to another." And so you ask writer friends for recommendations. So it's a kind of many different ways in which work kind of comes to us, but we're very small. I float this on my dime. My dime, as I like to tell friends, is much more of a nickel than a dime. And so it's the venture is modest, but the work is outsized. I think we punch far above our weight. We've got a really brilliant memoir that's coming out this fall. We moved from poetry and work in translation now to memoir and some kind of nonfiction. We've got by the terrific American novelist Alexandra Marshall, a book called The Silence of Your Name, The Afterlife of a Suicide, that we're going to be publishing next week. And so the work of translation is something I'd begun much earlier. I translated work of Drach and Rudenko and stuff, various Ukrainian poets, Bogdan Boychuk, a poem or two of Vasily Barka's. Anyway, so this was a little bit before the very fine press called Lost Rose Press had been established, which now publishes a good bit of Ukrainian work. So there wasn't much of a way for young Ukrainian poets to kind of find their way into the world. And this was something I was able to help out with here, with wonderful writers like Mariana Savka, Oksana Lutsishina more recently. So it's a kind of combination of everything. But we only do 6 to 8 books a year, and are kind of committed to selecting a small group of writers and doing all that we can to kind of promote their work. I love the process of watching this immaterial stuff, words, the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats wrote one of my favorite poems. This is his poem to a woman who was in love with Maud Gonne, who was an Irish revolutionary and who was being smeared late in her life by various sort of political factions. And he wrote this poem for her. Half close your eyelids, loosen your hair, and dream about the great and their pride. They have spoken against you everywhere. Now weigh this song with the great and their pride. I made it out of a mouthful of air. Their children's children shall say they have lied. The beauty that this poem, he's doing what Shakespeare had done long ago, right? Not marble nor the gilded monuments shall outlast this powerful rhyme. Is suggesting that the power of language of words, the right words in the right order can transcend time, can step outside it somehow and endure. And so watching these sort of evanescent things, these bubbles that pop out of our mouths, turn into scribbles on a page and then begin to materialize on paper in a book and then enter the world, is to me always thrilling and remarkable. That's the pleasure of working as a publisher.
Well, I think also the small press is very heroic. It keeps important ideas and important literature alive in today's world, where everything is turning into electronic ephemera, and also this kind of a lack of attention. And I think that it's an imperative vehicle for reading, and I applaud that. I think it's fabulous. Let's take a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Sure, delighted.
From the audience. Here's one from Iona. I am presently reading Dead Souls in English, translated by Donald Rayfield, and I feel it completely lacking in humor, while in Ukrainian it is very amusing. Why is this? It is very amazing, and why? the phenomenon of one being humorous and the other not.
Right. So I've not read that translation, and I kind of can't comment on why he fails to get that. But the humor is hard to translate, and humor is rooted in language, and it's rooted in the kind of awkwardness of experience within a specific social context. And so the things that were that you may get when you're reading the original are not necessarily going to have the same sort of resonances and equivalences. Now, we'd almost have to look at specific sentences to see and to kind of have an honest and useful examination of why it works in one context and not in the other. But so many things that were funny to us at one time no longer are, right? I mean, I think you can say that about movies that once seemed hilarious and now seem stilted and false and wooden. And at the same time, again, when you're reading another language, you have a whole sort of world of memories and other kinds of associations that really shape the experience you're having. A lot of translations, whether they're humorous or not, are wooden on the page. It takes a writer of comparable gifts, I think, to successfully render another work and convey its real sort of spirit and energy that matches the original. So it's
Well, the craft, I think that, well, not craft, but the discipline of translating is also a very high art.
Sure.
It takes whether a translator is an accomplished or practiced writer or not. I think it's a matter of really getting the nuances of that original language, its original context, as you say. Being able to understand and really kind of getting the gist of that sensibility that was originally shown, and that always, it's not always, successful. I mean, oftentimes it's not. That's why they have Pulitzer Prizes and other very, very venerable awards for such a practice, because it's not easy to do. And I'm very interested in the fact that you're doing that editing and your own writing. So it's I think one feeds into the other very naturally and organically at some point with practice.
Sure, I agree.
Mia Lysenko has a question. What is told? I guess she's referring to the first novel. What is told? Who from all the characters is most close to your heart and soul?
Oh, it would be the Louche character, Stefan, who is the kind of outsider in the family who is not particularly politically engaged, who spends a period of a kind of important period in interwar period in Paris, sort of having a private life while others were fighting the good fight. In some ways, his apartness felt to me touching and familiar, but I'm fond of a number of the other ones as well. I would like to know which one is her favorite.
We shall see in a minute if she responds. Iona also asks, can you expound on your statement, we're all suffering from the punishment of our embodiment, if I got your quote correctly?
Sure. Yeah. I suppose that there are many ways kind of to answer this. I can out myself as a Buddhist and say that this is another way of recognizing that life is suffering and that there is a way out of that suffering, and it's it not necessarily the kind of Greek tragic suffering at all moments, but it's the suffering of change, the suffering of time, the suffering that comes with age, the suffering that comes with loss, the loss of loved ones, the loss of places. I'm thinking now of this kind of great poem of Elizabeth Bishop, "The art of losing isn't hard to master," but say it, so it's disaster. So there's so much of a life is a falling away and a vanishing of things and people that we love. That's one sense of sort of suffering and loss. There are, of course, the aches and pains of growing pains when you're a kid, growing pains when you're middle-aged, growing pains when you're older. There are the ways in which you are find yourself living in a society that is far from just, fair, or equitable, and yet you have a sense of justice, and you have a sense of equity, and you have a sense of fairness. Where from those that's a question I'd love to talk about at some point and hear other people's opinion on it. But it's so there's so many ways in which we encounter a world whose harshness feels inexplicable, and we sometimes contribute to it. We sometimes are its victims. To find a way to equanimity, steadiness, and some kind of useful, active, not passive, active peace inside such a world is, to me, a worthwhile goal.
Here's one for me. Completely different. What's on your nightstand at the moment?
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I love that the question.
Besides a glass of water.
Right, my Poland Springs. It's a book that I had longed to read ages ago and never did. A book that my wife had reviewed years ago, Shirley Hazard's The Transit of Venus. I don't know if you're familiar with that novel. I was reminded of it because there was a review of of a couple of her books, which have been recently republished, I think, with the New York Review of Books, and a passage had been quoted that just kind of whet my appetite, and I was just thinking, just before our session began, I had been reading a couple of pages of it, and there's a quality to that prose. I've not yet named it, but I'm tempted to write about it because it's so provocative and delicious. It is her descriptions of a place and of her characters are so oblique and tangential that you have to read the sentences 2 or 3 times to say, wait, what what's the image I'm seeing here? And you realize that, you know, she's finding a way to kind of capture what could be a conventionally described moment in ways that make that moment feel alive and engage me as a reader, so that my eyes are not sliding off the page and kind of going to the next sentence too quickly. They're sort of lingering, and I'm letting the sort of experience of the life that she is describing kind of rise up. So that's one of the things. And then another is Svetlana Alexeyevich's Secondhand Time, The Last of the Soviets, the Belarusian kind of great chronicler of the Soviet experience. And that's partly in preparation for a conversation I'm going to be having with a number of Eastern European writers in a couple of weeks. Those are two things, but then there are always, of course, books of poetry and manuscripts that I'm looking at. Also, very close at hand. There's a wonderful book that we're going to be publishing in December called Mrs. Schmetterling by a wonderful poet from Texas, Robin Davidson. That has just been thrilling me, and it's sort of it's a response to work by a Polish poet. So, yeah. I tend to have half a dozen books going at one time, and I'm always sort of trying to trim it back to one, because there's, of course, the great joy of kind of complete immersion. And but the other book that I just started, I'm very excited about, is Paul Auster's biography of Stephen Crane, a writer I had not read in many years, but whom I once thought of very highly. And this is a kind of a thrilling 700-page project. To an attempt to bring him back to our awareness. You know, so he's a writer everybody reads in high school, A Red Badge of Courage, then kind of forget about. But he was a really, and Paul is making a very strong case for him as one of the first modernists. So those are, that's some of it.
Fabulous, busy. Speaking of the conference you're going to be participating in, it's on Saturday, November 13th, and this is something I wanted to also to let our audience know, that you'll be moderating this event coordinated by the Writers for Democratic Action. And the name of the event is The State of Democracy in Eastern Europe. I listed a couple of websites for audience's consideration at the top of the chat box. So please, if you'd like to cut and paste those or copy them for your later exploration, please do. Can you tell us a little bit about this, please? Both about the Writers for Democratic Action and also the upcoming conference or talk.
Yeah, gladly. Thanks, Andrew. So Writers for Democratic Action is a group of writers who got together sometime a little bit more than a year ago, as we were anxious about the upcoming elections. And we are a group who focused on doing all that we can do as writers to keep our democracy in place. This sounds perhaps like a huge ambition, but it's, to me, an absolutely necessary struggle. You know, I think that for the longest time, I took the democratic kind of process in this country for granted. Mm-hmm. How silly of me. As I have dug deeper into the history of our country and its democracy, I see that there has always been a tension and a struggle between an impulse toward authoritarianism and autocracy and an oligarchy, and another sort of equally powerful impulse to live by the will of the people. To kind of put it very crudely and simply, but that is sort of, that's the kind of delineation and tension that was described by Alexis de Tocqueville in writing about democracy in America in the 1830s. Yeah, It's an old struggle and tension. So we were 7 writers, including Paul Auster, Carolyn Forche, Todd Gitlin, Peter Balakian, Sophie Auster, Robin Davidson. Anyway, 7 of us kind of got together and formed this group. But there are now about 2,500 writers worldwide who are members. And what we are doing is organizing symposia in which writers and political and social leaders take part and have conversations, particularly focused on those states where there are very obvious attempts being made to trim back the capacity and ability of people to vote, and the so-called swing states. And we're also interested in probing what is behind the kind of anti-democratic spirit worldwide, because this phenomenon is of this backlash, if you will, against democracy is not limited to the United States alone. We see it in Latin America, we see it in Asia, we see it in Africa, we see it in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, there are some very kind of dramatic cases right in the same neighborhood. I mean, you have Belarus and you have Ukraine, 2 very different kind of situations among neighbors. And so we've invited writers from those regions. In this case, the panel that I'm going to be moderating is going to have 4 fabulous writers: Julie Fiodorchuk from Poland, Andriy Kurkov, head of Ukrainian PEN from Ukraine, Maxim Osipov, a great physician, writer from Russia, and Valzhina Mort, a marvelous Belarusian poet who is currently living in the United States, who are going to be talking about the state of democracy in their native realms. Please do join us. I mean, I think that this is very much an audience that whose observations would be truly welcome and valuable.
We have the both the website page for Writers for Democratic Action and also for the conference as well, where you can register. So I urge you to, if you can, please attend. It's on November 13th, Saturday at 3. Is that a Saturday? Or?
Yes, it's a Saturday at 3 p.m.
At 3 p.m. So please do. Askold, decidedly our program must come to a conclusion. I would love to talk with you all night on these issues and topics. Unfortunately, we have to conclude. But thank you ever so much for sharing your time with us today and for your enduring contributions to contemporary literature. In the future, we look forward to hosting a personal visit. We've talked about that. We brought that up on conversation earlier, and we would love to host you again. We wish you the very, very best for continued success, and special thanks to all of you at home for taking the time to attend today's presentation. It's because of you, your interest, support, and participation that such events are possible here. I hope each of you found a nugget of inspiration for further thought and reading. I urge you to seek out Askold's books, whether you have an affinity for short stories or novels, and for their astute commentary on culture and society. You can readily find them on Amazon.com, and I also included a website link to Amazon, to Askold's page on Amazon, which has all his readily available publications. For further information about the Ukrainian Institute of America, our current and upcoming programming, please visit us at ukrainianinstitute.org. We hope to see all of you soon. And Askold, thank you ever so much again. It was a thrill to speak with you tonight.
Andrew, thank you very much for a really substantial conversation. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you very much to Walter and to everybody also behind the scenes. I know how much work there goes into making one of these sessions possible. Thank you very much to all who also attended. And I really look forward to seeing you in person in New York or in Boston.
Either or.
Great.
We spent a lot of time in Boston the last 4 years. My daughter went to school there, so.
Yes, well, I'm sorry we hadn't crossed paths before then. We'll make it up next time.
Very well.
I very much look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you all, and good night.
Good night.